Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Hello, welcome to Ham and Jam, another exciting episode. I'm your co-host, Kevin Getz, reporting live from Bloomington, Indiana in the States, along with my partner,
Andy Bryant, the UK component of Ham and Jam. How are we doing, Kev?
What's doing fantastic. Of course, we're trying to unbury ourselves from all the snowfall that we've had. Believe me, I'm ready for spring to come around. I'm tired of it.
Yeah, I hear that, mate. I'm not a winter person. I can't wait to get that season going and get back out under canvas again.
No kidding. But I can't think of a better place to be to escape the winter blues than a return trip to Arnhem. And I am truly excited about our guest, James Daly. James, how you doing?
Not too bad, thanks, Kev. How are you?
Oh, fantastic. And this is going to be really exciting. I don't know about you, Andy. I always used to be about Operation Market Garden as events were unfolding, but I never really gave it much thought as to everything that was transpiring before then. And I think this is going to be really good. I know I'm going to get an absolute education on this, but obviously I'm enjoying a fine pint of Guinness. Andy, what have you got?
I'm going to shock you now. I am actually drinking a stout that just happens to come from Ireland. It's kind of a black and white in color.
Well, if our listeners could now see my eye roll, we all know it's Guinness.
Yeah, all right, it's Guinness.
Let's be real.
All right, it's Guinness. Yes, I'm drinking a Guinness. Shock horror again.
Yeah, shocker. I think I saw the landlord. He already had it poured for you, ready to go. James, what are you drinking?
I'm being rather boring at the moment. I'm drinking blackcurrant juice, but if I was, it would be neck oil, which is an IPA that's quite popular in Britain at the moment. It's really, I've been enjoying that over Christmas.
Good choice.
Nice. That's excellent.
Before we go any further, it's traditional, gentlemen, to raise a glass.
Oh, that's correct.
Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam. So let's dive straight in. James, obviously your book is fantastic, and I'm still needing a copy for my shelf. And I know Andy has read it. How'd you get started in that? I mean, what was the interest factor?
So it all starts, my granddad was an Arnhem veteran, which is a whole other story and quite a long and detailed story. But he died when I was quite young. We didn't know much about what happened to him. And I just became really interested when you're really young and you hear about your granddad being involved in this amazing story. And oh, by the way, there's a film made about it. It just gets better and better. I studied history at university. I've worked in museums for about 20, 25 years now. And I always wanted to write something about Arnhem. But for a long time, I felt that there was so much been done about Arnhem. And I didn't want to just rehash what other people had done, which, okay, you can probably just write another general history of Arnhem and it will sell lots of copies. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something that I thought would add to people's understanding and help to move the debate on a bit, which I think is always important as a historian to think, what are you contributing to the debate?
You absolutely hit it. A debate, because doesn't everybody have an opinion on Market Garden and whether it should have happened, shouldn't happen? I mean, I've even changed my opinion from week to week.
Yeah, and I think as a historian, one of the things that you learn quite early on is, if you're looking to do research, either look for some new sources that nobody's looked at before, or radically look at some sources other people have already looked at and really interrogate them in a different way. And for years, I was trying to find some new sources or a new angle. And I was watching Bridge Too Far one day, and there's the scene where Boy Browning is berating the intelligence officer, the rather hapless Brian Urquhart, about how many operations had been cancelled. And it hit me. That's a lot of operations that had been cancelled, but we knew so little about them. And looking at the general histories about Arnhem, so Middlebrook and Geoffrey Powell, all those sorts of authors, even they didn't agree amongst themselves how many cancelled operations there were. And some of them, it transpires, actually, for whatever reason, got these operations slightly wrong. So I thought this is a really important thread, that Market Garden, in a lot of sense, no military operation truly starts at H hour on D-Day, because D-Day doesn't start at 6 a.m. on the 6th of June. It's months or arguably years in the preparation. And if you don't understand that period leading up to it, you probably don't understand it fully. So I spent about 10 years, I think it was, ploughing through a lot of the original planning documents at the National Archives in Kew in London. And luckily, particularly being airborne operations, there are huge swathes of planning documents. So loading tables, maps, operation orders, intelligence summaries. There was absolutely no lack of stuff to work through. So in my spare time, alongside the day job I was doing, going up there once or twice a year, photocopying thousands of images and then spending the rest of the year, evenings and weekends, just working through them and putting together the 2 books that came out last year.
Just give an estimate. How many documents do you think did you plow through?
Oh, well, I mean, at the National Archives, a document could actually be a box of documents, but I looked through over 100 references alone, and some of those, that can range from a couple of sheets of paper each to an archive box crammed full of stuff. And you don't quite know till you order it what you're going to get. Because sometimes a really interesting looking reference in the catalogue, you think, oh, this is going to be gold dust, is actually just 2 sides of foolscap and doesn't tell you anything at all. And then something that looks really innocuous could be a huge amount of stuff. Or sometimes you get a load of documents that look interesting and then you look through them and they're not, but you've still got to go through to exclude them from your inquiries so that you know they're not useful. So it's real detective work. And that's probably the part of history that I really enjoy, getting to grips with the original stuff, that sort of sleuthing through it all.
So at what point did you realise this was actually going to be a 2-volume set of books rather than 1? Or was it always going to be a 2 set of books?
Yeah. So the original plan was 1, but considering the size and the general economic situation at the moment, the publishers suggested, why don't you split it into 2? Because it makes it more manageable for people in terms of buying one, then buying the other when that comes out. And also there's one that's focused mainly on Normandy. And then there's another one that's focused mainly on the build up to Arnhem. So if people had an interest in one, but not the other, it makes it a bit more flexible for them. And I think we're all very conscious that things cost a lot of money nowadays. So I think, yeah, that's something I think was really good, actually.
Yeah, I've read the first one and it's really good. Your Operation Overlord, with wastage to hands up the operations that were cancelled. I've yet to read The Liberation of Europe, your cancelled operations from the Flay's Pocket to Operation Market Garden. So I've got that to come, which I'm looking forward to. But if the first book is anything to go by, it's going to be good.
Oh, cheers.
Was there any one document that you were doing in your research when you're going through it and suddenly it just hits you in the face that you've got gold?
There are a few. I think anything that had maps with drop zones marked on was gold dust, because then there's loads of great fun about transposing those onto the modern maps and working out where they were. Grid references are great as well, because you can use the Echo Delta converter online to convert those to the modern grid reference. And there were a few really wry things, like there's a great one where Eisenhower was talking to Washington about who's going to command the First Allied Airborne Army. And they list about 5 candidates and Brereton's not even on the list. So I'd never heard of that. Suddenly it puts Brereton and what happened with the First Allied Airborne Army in a lot more context. It's a complete aside, but there's a great bit from Montgomery to de Gongen, his chief of staff, where about the 1st of September, they're talking about what divisions and corps to send where. And Montgomery says to de Gongen, hopefully the Belgian brigade will go into Brussels and sit tight, and that's the last we'll see of them, which is typically Montgomery. And then he says, we've just liberated a bit of Holland up near the Scheldt. Send the Dutch brigade there, and then they can just go and play around in that. It's just so classic Montgomery. Nothing to do with what I was writing about.
No.
That's another Sod's Law thing of archive research. You will find the most amazing things that are nothing to do with what you're looking for.
Oh, yeah, that's my life at the moment. Whenever I'm doing research, I have to remember to stay on track on what I'm doing. There's lots of rabbit holes to go off when you're doing research. But the first half of your book there is a lot of the politics. And you mentioned the who's going to lead this First Allied Airborne Army. And there's a lot of that in the book to begin with, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, because you've got small p politics squared in many respects, because you've got inter-service politics. So not just the Army and the Royal Air Force, but sometimes the Navy comes into this too, because you're launching operations across the Channel. Sometimes you're looking at liberating port. The Navy obviously has a big say in that. The development of airborne forces in Britain is very vulnerable to that relationship between the Army and the Royal Air Force in the early days. And even by 1944, those kinks have not really been ironed out. So that's very vulnerable. And then you've got the international relations as well. So on the whole, I think the British and Americans are getting on, are working together extremely well. But it would be, in some respects, it would be shocking if there weren't cultural differences and there weren't different ways of doing things and different experiences of the war up to that point. So airborne operations are extremely vulnerable to a lot of factors that other operations, say, when they're planning Operation Goodwood, that's simply not vulnerable to anywhere near as many of these political considerations as the airborne operations are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it really comes across in the book as well. What I picked up on was how reliant we were on the Americans for the transport planes to actually, service these two airborne divisions that we've got. And we're coming up short on planes.
Yeah, and I think that's a reflection of the effort to put together Bomber Command for the bomber offensive. The Royal Air Force, from their perspective, you can completely understand, didn't want to release aircraft from that to what they viewed as a less important role. But yeah, we were completely dependent on the Americans, particularly the C-47s. Pretty much every vehicle or piece of equipment or aircraft has been described as war-winning at some point. And I think the true factor actually is it's a jigsaw of lots of these things slotting together. And I always think the C-47 is really a hugely important aircraft.
Don't get Kevin started on that one because you'll be browbeaten about the Horsa until the cows come home.
Aside from that, yes. But certainly if you read the accounts of the veterans, and we just did an episode with Michael Hurst and his dad, Private William Hurst, the 156, absolutely loved the Dakota. Said it was an absolutely spectacular aircraft. And certainly those guys that were jumping out of it loved it and how crucial it was in the overall strategic picture.
Yeah, and I think there's something as well about the sheer number of them, the ability to produce that many of them quickly. When you go and look at them, they're fairly basic, which means they're easy to maintain and turn around. I think it ticks lots of boxes for the job they were meant to do.
You brought up political. I've always found Ridgway an interesting character. Were you able to find in your research what was Browning's and Ridgway's working relationship like? Because I'm thinking in terms of if Ridgway would have been a better selection as opposed to Brereton.
Browning is always, I think, going to be the most controversial airborne general of the Second World War. I think in some respects, it's not so much the relationship between Browning and Ridgway that's the issue. I think it's the spectre of Ridgway and the impact that has on Browning. So in some respects, it's just his presence in theatre. So Browning, obviously coming from the Grenadier Guards, he's almost self-selected for the role. And there are even points where it's almost like he appoints himself to be Commander of Airborne Forces. It doesn't seem to have been seriously considered that anyone else was going to do it. And I think that knowing the politics of the British Army, a Grenadier Guardsman who's well connected, it's going to be hard to winkle him out. But he's not experienced. And in some respects, not many generals are at this point. But if any of them were, he certainly wasn't. And I do wonder whether that means Browning tries to overstrive to get into action or to prove himself, because there are people like Ridgway, Gavin around who have much, much more experience. And that does show. And also, I don't think Browning was what you would call an allied general in terms of his sort of lack of tact that comes across in lots of this stuff. So, yeah, it's an extremely complex picture.
He wasn't really held in high regard by Jim Gavin, was he, really? Jim Gavin didn't really have a lot of good words to say about him.
No, and I think there were some, if you look at Gavin's accounts, there are some quite undiplomatic incidents around the Mediterranean and coming back from the Mediterranean, and some rather unfortunate comments Browning probably made off the cuff and weren't well timed or well thought out. And I think it shows with alliance warfare, that sort of stuff is really important. It is really important to build relationships and keep those relationships going. And that's something Montgomery gets castigated for. And Browning's probably a similar picture here, where he might not even have intended it in that way, but it's just
the way it came out.
It's just the way it came out, and sort of cultural differences probably, but unfortunate when you think about the consequences.
So going back to the council's operations, because we've gone down a rabbit hole again.
There's plenty of
That's what we do best.
What we do best. It's all good stuff. Going back to the transport situation, is this a contributing factor to some of these operations being cancelled after D-Day?
It certainly shapes them. So the first operations that are slated for 1st Airborne Division after D-Day are Wastage and Tuxedo, which would have been emergency reinforcement fly-in ops starting a couple of days after D-Day. The reason those could only take place from D+3 onwards would be that's how long they estimated it would take to turn around the transport aircraft from D-Day. So taking into account potential losses, any repairs, aircrew fatigue, that sort of stuff, and how long it would take to actually clear the marshalling airfields and get the division there. So although the Allies have got 4 airborne divisions, and then shortly after that the 17th Airborne turn up, they haven't got anywhere near enough aircraft to move them all in one go. So it's not so much the amount of airborne forces that are available that's the deciding factor, it's the lift for them. And not just the lift, but the ability to lift them all simultaneously. And that's why we see Market Garden taking 3 days to get the divisions in. That's not a factor that starts on the 17th of September. That's a factor that starts on the 6th of June, really.
That's interesting because Hollinghurst is like, yeah, we can do 2 lifts. And Williams is like, no, we can't. And I find it's interesting you have this battle between the 2 groups of saying, yeah, we can do it, let's do it. And another one saying, no, we can only do 1 lift a day.
Yeah, I think there are several perspectives on that. And I'm not 100% sure what I think, but I think that one argument is that by the time you're getting to September in Northwest Europe, daylight's getting a lot shorter. So they're starting to run out of daylight to do 2 lifts. And also, the further you get towards Germany, the further you're getting from the airfields in Britain. So the journeys are longer. So if you're going from, say, the south coast to Normandy in June, you've got a lot of daylight to play with. And the channel's relatively securely held. You're going to Holland in September. That's a very different picture in many ways, and completely get that. But I think also there is a perspective of airborne operations by their very nature need to be risky, because if they're 100% guaranteed to succeed, there wouldn't be any point doing it, because it would just happen anyway by overland, if that makes sense. Where I think, and I think there's always a differing level at which the ground forces and the air forces are willing to accept losses. And I think there maybe were occasions where the air forces needed to accept that if you're going to fly thousands of aircraft over enemy held territory, you are going to lose some of them, because that's just the nature of what you're trying to do. And going back to that politics thing between the army and the air force, that's a relationship, I think, that's not really where it needs to be in 1944 in terms of what the acceptable loss levels are, in terms of what the objective is.
Well, I don't know where Andy falls on this. I've always been on the camp of, if you're going to roll the dice, 2 lifts in 1 day, because by the time you've done that first lift, the surprise factor is completely over with. Because it seems to me in the history of the usage of British airborne forces, it's always been about surprise, taking that objective quickly by surprise. And if you spread your lifts out over 3 days, that factor has been completely null. Everybody knows what's happening by the 18th.
Yeah, and I think that would be the takeaway from Normandy. And I think one of the tragedies of airborne forces in 1944 is where 6th Airborne in particular don't get back to Britain till late August. there's simply no time for any sort of wash up or debrief or learn first Airborne, apart from an anecdotal conversation between Browning and Gale about drop zones. But that's sort of second hand. Ideally, what they really needed was basically to write the manual for the next. And they didn't get the opportunity to do that.
Do you think some of those operations were canceled because Allied land forces were advancing so quickly?
Yeah, I think so. And also, it's very difficult to work out. So you do get the feeling at times they didn't know where the front line was or what the rate of advance was. So it's difficult to know how far you're going to drop behind enemy lines if you don't know where the front line is. And I think we're used now to having nice graphics. So Ukraine, we've got lots of lovely graphics on the BBC about all of this. Nobody would have had access to anything like that in 1944. So they're drawing lines on maps where they think everyone is.
Talking about the cancelled operations, Wild Oats, this one catches my eye because on a personal level, my grandfather was 43rd Wessex Division, and so he fought in the second battle for Hill 112. And Hill 112 plays quite a part in Operation Wild Oats, doesn't it?
Yeah, and Wild Oats is a fascinating operation and probably the most controversial, at least in the first book. And I think because of what happened at Villers-Bocage with Wittmann and the Desert Rats, everyone has a view on Wild Oats about it probably would have been just like Arnhem because it's a single road and airborne division, panzers. It's very different because the front line is still relatively open because you're talking about a week after D-Day and the Germans are still throwing in Kampfgruppen wherever they can, committing divisions piecemeal rather than in a strategic way. And that in some respects, that's a perfect scenario for an airborne operation to outflank Caen while the front line's still quite open. And I think Villers-Bocage, although Wittmann caused a lot of damage, probably feels quite different if there's an airborne division suddenly landing in the rear. The German command, you think, oh, actually, this is a bit of a problem now, probably. Yeah. And yeah, so I'd have to admit, I waver in my opinions on Wild Oats all the time about whether it would have been a success or whether it would have been a disaster. And I think one of the things that always strikes me about these plans is that Montgomery is often castigated for being cautious. You couldn't call Wild Oats cautious, whatever your opinion on it. It's certainly imaginative, and it would have used airborne forces in a strategic sense. And one of the things I often say is it'd be great if people out there want to war game it and see how these things work out, because I don't know.
Now, as I say, that one certainly caught my eye. I mean, you're talking about, as you said, that this is when that was proposed, the Germans hadn't got the armour in strength at that time. So,
yeah, definitely. And I think when it's fluid, I think that's when you've got opportunities for airborne forces. But when a couple of weeks later, you've got far more. So the front around Caen is pretty much made up of lots of panzer divisions just getting thrown in as soon as they arrive. That's much less ideal for an airborne division to try and unlock, as we see in September. Yeah. But those early days where it's quite fluid, you've got lots of static divisions that have been pushed back and ad hoc formations. That's probably it's a very different scenario, I think.
Yeah. So after Wild Oats, you had Beneficiary.
Yeah, so after Wild Oats, I think when the front line starts to solidify in Normandy, I think there's a realisation that the time for airborne forces in Normandy itself has passed, and a lot of the attention moves on to Brittany. So Brittany features quite highly in the logistical planning around capturing deep water ports, because you've got Saint-Malo, you've got Brest, you've got Saint-Nazaire, places like that. Beneficiary is a plan to use an airborne force to capture Saint-Malo in conjunction with a seaborne landing. And I think this shows perfectly how a lot of these operations, although we regard them as an airborne operation, it's just a component of a bigger plan. So this is essentially a mini D-Day with the British Airborne Division and a parachute infantry regiment from the US and a US division landing over the beaches. So it's effectively a mini D-Day. You're talking about a naval force to land them, bombarding, extremely complex. One of the problems with Brittany is that most of these ports are heavily defended because they've been identified by the Germans as a potential target. So There's often a lot of coastal artillery. The beach obstacles are always quite strong. These are, operations that you tend to think, yeah, probably a good thing that didn't happen. The distance is a lot further than Normandy as well.
Which was the operation where they proposed to land gliders on the beach?
Yeah, that's fishery.
That is beneficiary, yeah, I thought so.
There are some quite nice, wide, sandy beaches in Brittany, and they proposed to land part of the glider on a beach at low tide, which always strikes me as a bit dicey, really, because you better hope they've got the tide times right.
Especially since they just got done having Sicily in 1943.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
How many of these, obviously you've been able to study them in depth, in your opinion, just come across as completely harebrained? What are they thinking?
Yeah, I think the most harebrained, I would have to say, would be Infatuate. There's a week or so where there are some discussions about using the Airborne Division at Walcheren to open up the Scheldt. Now, Walcheren, even at the best of times, is half underwater. It's a relatively small island, and the Germans were able to flood it by sort of bursting the dikes. And then before the landings that happened late in November, the Allies flooded it by breaching the sea wall. None of this sounds particularly great for airborne forces, does it really? We think about what happened in Normandy with flooded areas. It doesn't feel like a great idea to me. It's a bit of a no-go, I think, really.
I did have a question. Andy and I had talked about this as well. As you're doing your research, did you find anything, any documents, anything with regards to the morale of the 1st Airborne? They're getting ginned up, they're ready to go, cancel. That constant up and down, are they running into morale, discipline issues? Do we start to see more discipline problems, AWOL, that sort of thing?
So there is a point after Transfigure is cancelled in early August. There was a plan to land an airborne force between Paris and Orléans to cut off the German retreat. That's cancelled at short notice, and Browning actually sends a message. I found this in the 1st Air Landing Brigade war diaries, but presumably it went further, sympathising with the personnel about being stood up and cancelled several times, and reiterates to them that when we do go, it will be decisive, and we're going to be used to help end the war. So he tries to explain why these things have been cancelled, and he ends it with, "If you're as irritated as I am, I feel sorry for the Germans when we do eventually go." So he's clearly trying to buoy them up, but that also is an acceptance, I guess, that things aren't great. Urquhart, I looked at Urquhart's memoirs at the Imperial War Museum, and I think possibly one of the most hapless people in all of this is Roy Urquhart, because he's clearly a very capable, very well-regarded man. And he said that the cancellations were maddening because he had, on the one hand, some very good caliber troops, but who hadn't trained together in terms of exercising as units and formations. And they couldn't do that while all these operations were being planned and cancelled. So it was the worst of scenario where you had lots of good, highly motivated men who were then getting annoyed and being stood to. So it sounded like an extremely difficult circumstance for a GOC to lead, really. It's almost an impossible situation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the 1st Airborne Division actually only got one exercise where they actually managed to exercise as a division. That was Mush, wasn't it, I think?
Yeah, and even then that was to provide an opposition force to 6th Airborne before they went to Normandy. So it wasn't actually aimed at bringing 1st Airborne Division along. So and it's not so much the operations being cancelled that causes the issue. It's what can't happen because of that. And I think that does show in September, sadly, in terms of the handling of battalions and brigades. At a lower level, there's clearly nothing wrong with the calibre of the field craft and everything of the personnel. It's the tactical and operational level where things start to become a problem.
Do you think this is where the quotes that come out of the Market Garden operation about, by the time we went on Operation Market Garden, we were so keyed up we would have jumped into Berlin if asked? Do you think this is where a lot of this frustration comes from?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of these operations, the private soldier in a parachute infantry company wouldn't have known about a lot of them specifically. So a lot of these guys wouldn't have known about, say, Operation Sword Hilt at Brest, for example, until after the war, because it was only ever really discussed at an army level. So on the one hand, they wouldn't have been as bogged down with this planning thing like the staff officers would have been. But armies being armies, they would have known that they were being held for something and why isn't anything happening. And in some respects, that's worse, isn't it? Because soldiers being soldiers, they fill in the gaps.
Yes, they definitely do.
They're filling in the gaps, so then they start talking amongst themselves.
And the other thing as well, is once it gets to the briefing stage for these operations, that's it. The guys are sealed into the camp for security reasons. So they're constantly being locked in. Once that briefing's given, that's it.
And the other problem there is they're sealed in, and then when it's cancelled, they're let out. So before Normandy, they're sealed in, and then they go. Whereas for these operations, although the operation's cancelled, so things like the objective and that wouldn't have been important. I remember some of the veterans' accounts say there were no restrictions. We just, when we were let out, we just went to the pub. All of them just went and talked about it in the pub. In terms of OPSEC, that can't have been brilliant. In terms of who knows if there was anyone hanging around in Lincolnshire or Leicestershire listening. But as you can see from a discipline point of view, that's going to be difficult.
Because they're going to talk. It's just like the three of us sitting in our virtual pub, just chatting. That word is going to get out.
Yeah,
certainly.
Absolutely.
So how hard is it then for those lieutenants, those captains, trying to keep the morale up and trying to keep a lid on all this?
So it's not something I looked at in a huge amount of detail, but I get the feeling a lot of it does come down to individual character of officers. You find that there are some battalions that have problems. The 11th, for example, I think one of the battalions in the 1st Brigade as well had to have a change of CO. And a lot of this comes down to the officer team in these battalions and units about how they approach it and how they deal with it. So the 11th Battalion, for example, where they've just come back from the Mediterranean and they've had a company doing a different operation, there's much less cohesion. And I think where there's been unit cohesion and where there's been esprit de corps been able to develop, and you've got, for example, the 2nd Battalion, you've got a very characterful CO there, you've got some really strong character officers. They don't have as many problems as some of the other battalions. So a lot of this is drawing on the training and the ability of battalion and below officers to look after the blokes, so to speak.
We're heading on into market garden territory now. So let's talk about Comet, because obviously this is an ultimate operation that was cancelled and eventually morphed into market garden.
Yeah, and I think the thing with Comet is that, unfortunately, the way the film is presented gives people the impression that Market Garden is dreamt up on the 10th of September. And really, Market Garden is an evolution of Comet. If they'd called it Comet 2, that wouldn't have been unrealistic. So the general principle of bridges, single road, that's all set. Really, it's an upscale of Comet. There are some key differences. So the biggest difference probably for me is that there would have been glider coup de main landings at Graaf, Nijmegen and Arnhem by a glider company from each of the airborne landing battalions. Now, why that's considered okay on the 10th of September, but it's scrubbed by the 17th of September. There are various different thoughts about why, but that seems like quite an abrupt turnaround in 7 days. And I think knowing what we know about Pegasus Bridge and about what happens in Market Garden, I think you'd have to say that it must have been worth trying. If it's worth trying to capture a bridge, it's worth trying to capture a bridge.
Yeah, well, famously, when Market Garden is actually given the go-ahead, George Chatterton of the Glider Pilot Regiment offers us to land Hawser gliders on Arnhem Bridge, isn't he?
Yeah,
yes.
And I think if the glider pilots are willing to do it, they're the experts at landing gliders, that you'd think but I suspect something to do with that wider inter-service relationship about the Air Force probably weren't happy with it in the first place, and they took the extra time to work out how to nullify it because they were so concerned about flak. But of course, there's another argument that if you capture the bridge, then you don't have to worry about flak anyway. So a few gliders is probably a better way to do it.
Yeah. So Comet was just a plan for the 1st Airborne Division and the Polish Independent Brigade. What was the plan in theory for Comet?
So the plan for Comet is for a brigade of the 1st Airborne Division to land at each of the Graf, Nijmegen and Arnhem bridges, and basically making what became a divisional level task, a brigade level task. And the Poles would have landed later as a divisional reserve. So 4 Parachute Brigade would have been at Graf, the Air Landing Brigade, Nijmegen, and 1st Parachute Brigade at Arnhem. And it's interesting at Arnhem particularly where, because they're landing a brigade and a brigade glider element rather than a division, they use the drop zones that are nearest the bridge, so the ones that are around Walphazer rather than Ginkle Heath. So again, that tells you that Ginkle Heath is basically, I will use this one just because it's the next nearest one. So it tells you that given the chance, they'd quite obviously have preferred not to have had to use it. And that's similar with all the other drop zones. I think but the coup de man, when you look at the plans, the coup de man landing makes it feel a lot more achievable to me. What we don't know is which companies of the glider battalions would have been doing. But in my mind, I like to imagine Major Kane and his company at a bridge and trying and holding a bridge. And you think, yeah, he probably could have made a bloody good job of it.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, and you had talked about, the Ginkle Heath, and certainly Andy and I have been at Landing Zone S, but it's certainly when you see it in person, you're like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense why this area was chosen. It absolutely does, because it's big.
Yeah, I've been a few times now, and those drop zones around Walphazer and Ginkle Heath, I mean, as textbook airborne drop zones, they are absolutely perfect, aren't they? Sort of big, flat, wide.
It's just they're too far away if you're going to do it in a lift spread out over 3 days.
Yeah, it's a bloody long way when you factor in the time it takes to reorganise and deal with any casualties on the drop zone and that sort of thing. Yes, it's a ridiculously long way.
So at which point does Comet morph into Market Garden then?
So this is around the 8th to the 10th. This is when the German front line starts to solidify. So up until, I think it's about the 7th, the Germans are still in disarray. Everything's still quite open. No one really knows hugely where the front line is. But this is when the Germans start to put in place the blocking line on the Dutch-Belgian border. And I think Dempsey in particular notices that the front line's starting to harden up and that what they planned to do with Comet probably wasn't going to be achievable with a division. But rather than cancel it, he asks Montgomery for permission to do it as a corps level operation rather than a divisional level one. So they still think it's achievable, but they just recognise it's going to take more manpower to do it. But what I think is interesting there is that although they know that the retreat's starting to stop, they clearly underestimated the ability of the Germans to throw together these ad hoc camp grouping from whoever happened to be around. And that's something, again, that we see at Arnhem, isn't it? Their ability to just grab whoever happened to be at a train station and throw them into an emergency unit was quite remarkable, really.
I'm not a big fan of the what if, but I'm going to go ahead and pull the pin on this hand grenade and toss it.
You love it.
Oh, so if Market Garden happens or any variation thereof, a week, 10 days before September 17th, are we looking at this entirely differently? Does history change a little bit, or is it pretty much still follow true course?
I don't think we can say for certain, but I certainly think a lot of the challenges would have been much less serious. And you're talking about, the ability of the Germans to react would have been much more limited. So I think the deck would have been stacked much more in the Allies' favour than it was on the 17th of September. I think if you do it on the 8th, that's probably, that looking back, there's probably a very small window where it could have worked. And the 8th to the 10th was probably in hindsight.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface with this. Thanks ever so much for coming on. It's been absolutely brilliant.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Your 2 books out there for our listeners are obviously Operation Overlord and The Liberation of Europe, and they're both obviously cancelled Allied operations.
And I think too, they are the perfect real start to a full understanding of the events that are going to unfold starting on September 17th. I think it just absolutely helps with that bigger picture that we're always wanting to look at. I've always, Andy's heard me say it's a lot like a layer cake. It's just another layer of the cake that when you pull back, you go, oh, yep, that's a cake.
It's fascinating, as I said, to actually read about a lot of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes, the sort of the backroom deals and the politics involved. So that really caught my attention, as well as obviously the details of the operations themselves. So what do you think, Kev?
Getting the look.
We are, yeah, we're getting the look. So, yeah, the barman's calling time, gentlemen, please, on another episode of Ham and Jam. So, gentlemen, cheers.
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 Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
I'm going to go ahead and pull the pin on this hand grenade and toss it.